Um, Hello, everyone. We're about to begin. My name is Tom Merrill, and together with my colleague Alan Levine, I run American University's Political Theory Institute, the host of this evening's event. Alan unfortunately couldn't be here. Can you hear?
Yeah, louder, I think.
Would you like me to be louder? Is that better if I stand closer to the microphone? It's important that we get these things right. Is that good? So please tell me if it's too quiet. The Political Theory Institute's mission is to bring the great books and ideas of political theory to bear on contemporary issues and events. We aim to promote healthy citizenship by getting students and the larger civic community out of their echo chambers and to engage deeply and thoughtfully with both a wide array of views and with each other. Today's event is special for us, thanks to C-SPAN. We want to thank C-SPAN, who is here, and we especially want to thank the C-SPAN viewers who are watching this on reruns in the future, so hello to you. We have a wider audience than usual, and it's more intimate as we welcome back an American University alumnus as our speaker. American University consistently ranks as having among the most politically active student bodies in the country, and today's speaker, Yuval Levin, illustrates this perfectly. Levin, I thought you'd get a laugh out of that. Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush, as Executive Director of the President's Council on Bioethics, where I had the pleasure of working with him, and as a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. The founder and editor of the journal National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He is interviewed frequently on radio and television and has published essays and articles in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Commentary. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy, most recently, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. He holds an MA and PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and this is the really important part, BA from American University.
Go Eagles.
Go Eagles, that's right. One last introductory remark, actually a penultimate introductory remark. Tonight's event is our annual Constitution Day lecture, made possible with a grant from the Jack Miller Center, a tremendous private foundation dedicating to helping educators teach the ideas, documents, and history that lie at the heart of the American political tradition. Thank you, Jack Miller Center. And now I want to add something before we introduce Yuval, which is, as you know, American University has unrolled something called the Civic Life, which is President Alger's initiative to encourage civic engagement on campus and dialogue with people that we disagree with, those two things. Part of the Civic Life initiative, of which I'm the chair of the steering committee, is a program called the Civic Life Fellows, which is going to have a student part and a faculty part. Applications are open for the student Civic Life Fellowship program. I want to encourage all of the students who are in the room, if you're interested in this kind of work, we would love to have you apply. So please apply if you haven't. There should be an email in your inbox from President Alger with a link to do this. If you can't find it, please just talk to me. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our friend Yuval Levin on Can the Constitution Unify Americans? Thank you, Yuval.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to speak loudly, but I'll begin by apologizing that I'm just getting over a cough, and I have just spent an hour talking with some wonderful AU students, and will probably lose my voice in the course of this. I'll do my best to avoid that. I have to also begin by admitting that I just love AU. I love being a student here. I love every time I come back here. I met my wife here. It's a fantastic place, and those of you who get to be part of this community are very fortunate for it. And I think it's just a fantastic collection of people who care about politics, who care about the country's future. I always leave my time here with that impression, and I appreciate it. Is this working reliably? All right.
Yeah, the ceiling, can you turn that ceiling microphone off, that mic? I think that's on. Yeah, it's cutting in and out.
Oh, I see.
No, that's where the Zoom, that's where the.
Well, there's.
What's going in and out is the distance.
There's something's cutting in and out.
Okay.
The program.
Well, we'll do our best. I want to take up a subject with you that may seem a little strange in this moment, and it may seem a little strange because of the nature of this moment in American political life. The subject is how we might think about the Constitution of the United States as a framework for national unity. And it may seem strange because we are obviously living in a period of intense division in American public life. And it often seems like our constitutional system only makes our bitter conflicts and divisions worse and more intense. Congress and the presidency and the courts have all become both arenas and objects of culture war combat in recent years, so that frustration with the constitutional system now is really rampant and widespread. In fact, on the surface, it can often seem like just about everybody is frustrated with the Constitution for one reason or another. You hear frustration from the left that the system is too cumbersome or too slow or not democratic enough. You hear frustration from the right that the system sometimes will emphasize process over substance and so ignore the moral content of the common good in American life. Intense political combatants of all kinds are clearly frustrated with our Constitution for getting in their way. But that in itself, I think, is actually a point worth thinking about for us. The most polarized elements of every side of our culture war now think that the Constitution is fundamentally a tool or a weapon of the other side. They feel like it restrains them, it doesn't let them get their way. And they're right. The most intense combatants in our contemporary culture wars find the Constitution frustrating because a key part of its purpose is to frustrate intense political combatants and to keep the extremes from winning. It's to make sure that the system as a whole does not become a weapon for one side or another in the kinds of conflicts that are most dangerous to free societies, and to make sure instead that different sides to our disputes have to somehow deal with each other. That's what people find frustrating, but it's also one of the most valuable things about our constitutional system, and one of the most important things about it in this moment in particular. In other words, a key part of the Constitution's purpose is to facilitate greater national unity, to build common ground in our society, to reduce tensions, to make people less afraid of one another and less alienated from one another. Now, if that's right, then it would certainly suggest that our era of division is also an era of constitutional failure in some important sense. But it should force us to ask how much of that failure is a failure of constitutional practice rather than constitutional design, and therefore whether a renewal of our politics, a restoration of some of our national cohesion might require us to learn something from the Constitution and from its framers, and to return in some way to its core purposes. It should lead us to consider whether the Constitution might be, in some respects at least, more of a solution than a problem in this moment. And that is what I want to suggest to you today. Not that the Constitution's various critics are all wrong, but that they underestimate how much it has to offer them, because they tend not to see bitter division itself as an important problem to be addressed. They tend to accuse the Constitution of being too simple, too backward, too naive to work for us now. They say it's an 18th century relic that can't serve our more complicated moment. But I want to suggest to you that that is just about exactly wrong. Whatever its flaws, the Constitution is actually more sophisticated than most of its critics about the most significant challenge that confronts all modern free societies, the challenge of cohesion amid diversity, of holding together despite our differences. That challenge was very much on the minds of the framers. It's the first goal put forward in the preamble to the Constitution, to form a more perfect union. It's the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers, and it's an implicit subject of the rest of them. It was constantly on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention in one way or another. Unity is not the only purpose of the Constitution, obviously. The preamble goes on to list a series of other very complicated and ambitious aims, and the document speaks to much more than cohesion, but unity is one crucial purpose of it. And so the Constitution is in part an answer to the very question that we now constantly find ourselves forced to ask. How can a vast, diverse society hold together and govern itself? To see the Constitution through the lens of that question would help us to grasp some very important things about it that are not otherwise obvious. And it would help us to understand some facets of our contemporary national challenges that also are not otherwise obvious. It might even point us to some ways forward. So let me just briefly sketch out what seeing things that way could involve. First of all, to see that the Constitution is concerned with unity is to take notice of a very distinct understanding of unity that would be very useful to us now. It's an idea that's particularly evident in the thought of James Madison, who was uniquely attuned to the dangers of division and faction. Madison outlined a distinct understanding of the nature of political unity, which begins from an apparent contradiction in some of his thinking. On the one hand, he insisted that disagreement about fundamental questions is inherent and unavoidable in any free society. He put that point very bluntly in Federalist 10. He says, quote, "As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period." But just a week after that was published, writing in Federalist 14, Madison warned his readers not to despair of national union. Writing with unusual passion, at least for Madison, he said this, I quote, "Hearken not to the unnatural voice which tells you that the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, can no longer live together as members of the same family, can no longer continue the mutual guardians of their mutual happiness, can no longer be fellow citizens of one great, respectable, and flourishing empire. So Americans will never stop disagreeing, but should not give up on living as one nation. Unity is achievable provided that we don't expect it to mean unanimity." And so what should we expect it to mean? Embedded in the Constitution is a classical approach to this crucial question, a kind of Aristotelian answer that looks to politics as an arena for coming to agreement about common action. Simply put, in a free and therefore diverse society, unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. Now, this is not to say that citizens start out with no common foundation or no shared beliefs. Americans are not strangers to each other, and we do have some basic principles in common, especially those laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But although those widely accepted principles impose some general moral boundaries on American life, there's enormous room for disagreement within those boundaries. That includes some real disagreement about exactly what the Declaration's principles mean, let alone disagreement about discrete political and policy choices that we always have to make in politics. Our politics is unavoidably organized around these disagreements and requires us to find ways to act together without fully resolving them. But that formulation invites an obvious question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? I would suggest to you that the United States Constitution is, in many important respects, intended to be an answer to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? Almost everything that is mysterious and frustrating to many Americans now about our system of government is a function of its being in part an answer to that question. And a lot of the dysfunction of our contemporary political culture is a consequence of failures of constitutional practice that stand in the way of putting the Constitution's particular answer to that question into effect. The Constitution's answer is not simple-minded. There are simple-minded ways to answer that question. You might say, for example, that we act together when we don't think alike by just taking a vote and seeing what the majority wants to do. But that kind of answer would endanger minorities. And precisely because we do agree that all of us are created equal, and because we have lived a national history that too often is trampled over that truth, Americans know that although majority rule is an absolutely essential principle of legitimacy, it can sometimes also be a principle of despotism and of oppression. Our Constitution looks to help us act together when we don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority rights. That is not a simple task, and ours is therefore not a simple system of government. It looks to broaden majorities before empowering them, to restrain majorities while ultimately relying on them, It deals with tensions like this, even contradictions, by seeking a kind of dynamic balance between competing pressures over and over. That is its strength, but it's also why we sometimes find the Constitution so frustrating. Acting together when we don't think alike requires creating some space for competing approaches to coexist. It requires compelling opposing factions to bargain, to negotiate, and to seek accommodations. It requires administering the government in steady, predictable ways in accordance with those accommodations. And it requires enforcing clear boundaries on the powers of majorities and of public officials. This is the work of federalism, Congress, the president, and the courts, respectively. And it all requires a citizenry well-formed in some core Republican virtues by the very experience of acting together, even when we don't think alike. Looking at the parts of the Constitution through the lens of that distinct understanding of unity can help us to see each of those parts in a different light than we might normally see it. And so let me quickly suggest some of what that would look like. To begin with, we might avoid a common misunderstanding of American federalism. We tend to view federalism now through the lens of decentralization or subsidiarity. So we think of the states and the national government as layered over each other. And we think that federalism encourages us to emphasize the lower layers, the local and state ones. That's a way of thinking about federalism that's convenient to communitarians like me, and I certainly resort to it myself sometimes, but it is not quite right. It would be better to think of federalism as describing parallel governments, not layered ones. And the imperative of unity is a key reason why that is. American federalism is intended in part to reduce the number and scope of political controversies that have to be resolved uniformly at the national level. Federalism emerged as a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between partisans of a centralized national state and champions of a decentralized confederation. And their dispute ultimately came down largely to one core question. Would the national government govern the people directly, with the state serving as its administrative districts, or would the national government govern only the states in a few discrete areas, while the state governments alone would have direct contact with the American people? Unable to agree on either approach, the convention worked its way toward a novel idea. The state governments and the national government would both govern the people directly, but with regard to different subjects. They explicitly rejected a layered approach in favor of a parallel approach. Broadly speaking, the federal government would govern the economy, diplomacy, and defense, which may sound like a short list, but encompasses quite a lot, especially given the reach of economic policy. And the states would continue to govern everything else, including deploying the core police powers that constitute most of what government does. That peculiar kind of compound republic, as Madison called it, can let our national politics specialize in national challenges where we can't avoid the need to decide on one course of action, while state governments can focus on matters nearer at hand in their own different ways. That allows for a diversity of governing approaches to coexist at once, even to compete with each other, without having to be resolved into a single national approach in most arenas. That's never been a simple matter, to put it mildly. And in particular, the decision to leave the question of slavery and race up to the states proved both wrong and untenable, again, to put it mildly, and ultimately had to be reversed on the battlefield for the sake of both justice and union. The 14th Amendment added the imperative to apply the law equally to all citizens, to the federal government's relatively limited set of responsibilities. This was a necessary rebalancing of American federalism, and of course, in practice, it's taken a very long time to be put into effect. But with regard to many other contentious, if less existential questions, a separation of governing authorities offered and could still offer a practical means of allowing Americans to live with their diversity while still forging a cohesive national identity. Seen through the lens of cohesion, what matters most about federalism is this separation of governing authorities, which allows for some genuine diversity in the ends and not just the means of American government. It may be that we now need to broaden again the list of issues that belong in the federal purview, but it's crucial that we not combine state and federal authority over those issues and just let the states deploy different means to achieve federal ends, as we've done in education, in healthcare, in welfare, and in other areas in the last 70, 80 years now, very much to the detriment of the Constitution and its ability to keep us together. Constructive reforms of American federalism would need to untangle our parallel governments some and not to layer them over each other even more. Now, those questions that do need to be resolved at the national level are intended first and foremost to be addressed by bargaining in Congress. And the purpose of Congress also looks a little different in light of the Constitution's emphasis on unity. Congress is really at the center of the constitutional system, for good and bad. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates, Madison wrote in Federalist 51. Republican government is representative government. And although the presidency and to some extent also the courts are ultimately accountable to the people, it is only Congress that is designed to be representative of them. And Congress is, of course, the absolutely central institution in the Constitution's vision of unity, too. By representing our plurality, our national legislature can allow for negotiations among the key factions that compose that plurality. This is first and foremost a way in which the Constitution envisions Americans acting together even when we don't think alike, by negotiating broadly acceptable courses of action. That is really in some ways the essence of our national politics. It is the primary way in which the Constitution seeks to address the kind of problem that it was meant to take on. When it works, Congress can function as an arena of contention, of coalition building, sometimes even of integration, as the representatives of different American points of view oppose each other, are compelled to find ways to accommodate each other, and in some respects come to understand themselves as engaged in a common effort in ways that can reflect back on their constituents. Madison took this to be maybe the primary advantage of representative institutions. They can refine and elevate public sentiments and passions and give them forms more amenable to negotiated accommodation so that they can be turned into more coherent kinds of governing objectives. The people's representatives can reach arrangements that the people they represent could not have reached directly. This is a key reason why Congress is not simply majoritarian. The US Congress differs from the sorts of parliaments you'd find in most of the other democracies of the world because it doesn't empower simple majorities to govern unrestrained until they lose their mandates. The distinct overlapping electorates that choose the House and Senate, the constant threat of presidential vetoes, the assorted supermajorities requirements here and there, all mean that narrow and ephemeral majorities cannot exercise power effectively in our system. They have to deal with broad and durable minorities and work to build some consensus before they can really exercise genuine institutional power. This is in part, this is in part to protect minorities, but it's also to build consensus that reaches further than simple majority power, to make us more unified before we really act. This kind of coalition building often doesn't feel unifying as it's happening. Negotiating processes are inherently adversarial, but by compelling different factions to deal with each other with the aim of concrete common action in the end, those sorts of processes can forge common ground. An effective legislative accommodation doesn't just give each side half a loaf. It gives us practical experience in living and acting together. It builds cohesion. It builds social capital. As much as it is a source of public policy, Congress is a source of this kind of accommodation and an arena for working out differences in ways that can disarm dangerous divisions. A system with a reasonably functional Congress at its center is a system with that kind of accommodation at its center, and so with the desire and the ability to resolve disputes within a shared framework at its center. Now, needless to say, that is not what Congress generally looks like now. And so it's not what our political culture looks like. There have been some instances in recent years of genuine cross-partisan bargaining over key issues, especially, frankly, thanks to the filibuster in the Senate. But it's been all too rare, and much of the time, the institution is dominated by culture war theatrics and partisan grandstanding. That Congress is broken is the primary reason why our political culture is broken. But when reformers consider how Congress might need to change, they too often overlook what it is actually failing to do. Frustrated with the failure to advance their favored legislation rather than with the failure to advance national cohesion, they often yearn for the model of more narrowly majoritarian kinds of European parliaments. But that kind of model is not likely to yield durable legislation in the American system. And more important, it would further undermine the capacity of our politics to engage in common work toward reconcilable goals. If Congress is to be reformed, it should be reformed in ways that make bargaining across lines of difference more likely, not in ways that make that kind of bargaining less necessary. Too many of the well-intentioned proposals for reform of Congress out there now are on the wrong side of that distinction. They look to make the legislative process smoother and faster at the cost of making it narrower and more divisive. Congress's purpose is to compel people who disagree to deal with each other. Seeing that more clearly could help us to grasp how improving our practice of constitutionalism could also help us to build better solidarity. Now, the task of turning Congress's negotiated frameworks into functional administration falls to the President of the United States. But the President's role in facilitating national unity is not what it's often perceived to be either. Critics of the Constitution who are dissatisfied with how inefficient policymaking by bargaining and accommodation can be often look to the President to act more decisively on behalf of the nation. Some also insist that because the President is the only official elected by a national constituency, the President is the figure most representative of the public as a whole. But this is completely at odds with how the framers understood the office, and I think with how we should understand it too. The presidency is a unitary institution, and so it can't be a venue for accommodation and bargaining. It is the office of one person. It's a locus of action intended both to execute the laws and to respond to demanding practical challenges on behalf of the country. And the framers generally did not view the presidency as a representative institution. The chief executive is elected in order to keep him accountable, but no one person could be representative of a diverse society. To imagine that a single individual could hold us together by embodying our unity is to assume away our diversity, to suggest that we're already unified, but just not adequately represented. And that is what a lot of the Constitution's critics seem implicitly to assume. But the opposite is surely closer to the truth. Because we are a diverse society, representing us requires a plural institution, not a unitary one. But the president, among his other important functions, does have a distinct and crucial role in facilitating national unity. He does this especially by providing a stable backdrop for our national life. Stability, consistency, and predictability, what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration, forms the executive's distinct and crucial contribution to the unity of American society. Stability is essential to social peace. As Madison argued in Federalist 62, precarious, changeable administration makes it impossible for people to feel secure, to make plans, to take risks, to engage with each other across lines of difference. And unsteadiness in government makes it hard for anyone to be a faithful, law-abiding citizen. These arguments don't apply exclusively to the executive, of course. They're crucial with respect to Congress, too. But it is the president, because of his capacity for unitary action and direction, who bears the greatest responsibility to act with steadiness, to avoid sharp changes of direction or reversals of course, even the course of his predecessors, and to keep our government stable and secure. Stability is not stasis. The president is expected to give steady direction to our politics, even to some extent to Congress's work, to set general priorities, to propose some legislative measures, to veto ones that he disapproves of. But in doing all of that, the president's chief purpose, beyond the defense of the nation, is to turn Congress's negotiated directives into steady and consistent administrative action. The framers' emphasis of this peculiar point is unmistakable. And here, too, our contemporary constitutional practice has become disconnected from its intended aims. We've come to think of the president as speaking for a party more than acting for a nation. And a change of party in the White House now leads to a nasty whiplash as a new president rushes to undo his predecessor's signature executive actions and to put in place new measures of his own, many of which his successor will undo. The huge apparatus of agencies built up around the president, what's come to be called the administrative state, too often functions as a kind of substitute legislature, less slow and cumbersome than Congress, but not less partisan, a parliament of lawyers eager to fill through vigorous administrative rulemaking the various kinds of policy voids that the Constitution intended only incremental legislative accommodation and deal-making to fill. That obviously undermines the work of steady administration, but it is at least as harmful to our society's capacity for unity and civic peace. It vastly increases the stakes of presidential elections, and encourages us to see our society as two opposing camps arrayed against each other for control of the instruments of power. Reigning in the administrative state is therefore not just a matter of constraining government power. It would offer us a way to recover the capacity of our governing institutions to forge some of the common ground we lack, and the capacity of the presidency to secure a stable backdrop for American public life. The courts are also essential to making greater unity possible, but again, not necessarily in the way that we might first imagine. The crucial service they provide on that front is not the resolution of the disputes that divide our society. Courts do resolve disputes, of course, but they're intended to resolve disputes over what the law is and not what it should be. And so they're not the right venue for mediating among the competing visions of the public good that make up American public life. Great public disputes over what the law should be need to be resolved through the work of the legislature above all, and in a very different way from how the courts resolve disputes. And what the courts then do is make sure that those negotiated frameworks of law are carried out properly. So the most valuable service that the courts provide to the cause of national unity is in their policing of the rules and boundaries of American constitutionalism, their restricting of the power of majorities and public officials to pursue end runs around the structure of the system. The federal courts have enormous counter-majoritarian power, which makes them inherently dangerous to our republic. It's absolutely crucial that power like that be used to guard the structure of the system, to keep elected officials focused on their proper work, and not to substitute minority rule for majority rule. The temptation to use the courts to decisively resolve divisive political disputes is, of course, enormous. It was the strong inclination of the left, while left-leaning judges dominated the Supreme Court for many decades, but it's quickly becoming an inclination of the right as the courts come to be dominated by more right-leaning judges. And it is a grave mistake in both cases for the same reason. Elite fiats are no way to resolve divisive differences in our society. They usually only deepen our divisions. The courts must instead protect the space in which genuine resolution can happen, and especially the space in which Congress does its work, while also protecting the rights of individuals and of minorities against majority power, as guaranteed in the Constitution. It can do both at once by keeping everyone involved, public officials and citizens alike, true to the Constitution and bounded by its structure and its substance. It should prevent end runs, not facilitate them. But of course, end runs are now rampant. And none of the institutions of the system work quite as intended or as I've described here. This is in no small part, I would argue, because the Constitution's vision of the nature of unity in a free society has long been very controversial and contested. The idea that the Constitution exists to let us act together even when we don't think alike has never sat easily with some critics of the system. The deepest critiques have always been what I would call integralist objections to Madisonian pluralism. They argue that the system has to answer to one voice or one vision of the good, or else it can't possibly work. Woodrow Wilson was the most articulate of these critics. He argued that the framers operated with a kind of Newtonian image of government as a machine, but that in reality, government is more like an organism. And this means that separating powers and setting interests off against each other doesn't make sense. Wilson put it this way, I quote, "No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon their quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct or intelligence, their amicable community of purpose." He saw society as one living thing, not an assemblage of different voices. In other words, Wilson explicitly rejected the idea that it was even possible to act together when we don't think alike. Contemporary progressivism is often similarly integralist, insisting that every institution in our society, private and public, must be engaged in the same social crusade, no exceptions, no exemptions, and implicitly that there can be no society without a single comprehensive common project. There are some on the right who agree with that, but might substitute something more like Catholic natural law or the Christian legal tradition as the unifying vision that has to guide the social organism. Taken to its logical conclusion, that would mean that no sort of free society was possible, because people in a free society never will think alike. But Wilson was only calling for an incremental step in that direction, which would require a different form of democracy based on a more radical ideal of majority rule. He thought that democracy required a politics in which different parties offered comprehensive policy programs, the public selected among them on election day, and then the winning party would have essentially unlimited power to pursue its program until the public voted for somebody else. The Westminster model works more or less along these lines. It's a legitimate democratic model of government, but it's one geared more to the demands of administration and accountability than of accommodation and social peace. Wilson was not blind to the need for unity, but he was deaf to the logic of building cohesion by representing plurality. Unity, he thought, should be achieved by unitary leadership, and therefore, above all, by the president, who alone has the national mandate to speak on behalf of the entire society. That sort of critique points toward dramatically different ways of understanding each of the key institutions of our system. It has no patience for the havoc and disorder of federalism and wants the system ordered by national priorities. It wants a much more disciplined Congress, answering to party leaders and accountable to more coherent partisan platforms. It wants to substitute orderly administration and adjudication for messy deliberation. It wants the president to stand in for the nation. And of course, our system has moved in exactly that direction now for many decades. That's happened under both parties. As a practical matter, for example, the most Wilsonian congressional leader in American history was surely my old boss, Newt Gingrich. But whatever might be said about the administrative and ideological consequences of this counter-Madisonian turn in American constitutional practice, we would surely have to acknowledge that it has contributed to making us more divided. It's made our politics more partisan. It's raised the stakes and therefore the temperature of our elections. It's closed off some essential venues for deliberation and accommodation. And so it's left us with fewer tools for combating polarization and fragmentation. The Wilsonian turn in our constitutionalism is not the only reason that we're divided, needless to say, but it is why we think our Constitution can't help us to address our divisions, why we think it's a relic with nothing to offer us. In reality, the Constitution was designed to address just the kind of problem that we're facing, and it could make a real difference if we let it. Better grasping the presumptions and ambitions that underlie the Madisonian system could help us to see that in our divided moment, the Constitution is less the problem than the solution, or at least that we need to let the logic of the system better inform our practice of constitutionalism. But there is one final lesson that we can draw from the Constitution's peculiar approach to unity that could be very helpful for us now. And it points back toward the more serious criticisms that are now offered of our system. These critiques are generally arguments for a simpler majoritarianism. They suggest that our system is standing in the way of change the public wants. And so they imply that our divisions are just illusions and that we actually are fairly unified, but are denied what we want by a system geared to frustrate us. There have been times in our history when something like that has been true, when the deliberate recalcitrance of the American Constitution has been our key problem, when large majorities of Americans expressed a clear set of desires for an extended period of time, but were denied what they sought by the institutional rigidity of our system of government. There have been other times, however, when strife and discord in our society have been our foremost problems, when Americans were bitterly divided and viewed one another more as enemies than friends, and so have been unable to form clear, durable political aspirations beyond getting rid of their opponents. We are plainly living in one of those latter moments now. There is no broad and durable American majority advancing a coherent agenda that is somehow obstructed by our Constitution. Simple majoritarianism just wouldn't be very useful when there aren't clear majorities for anything. Rather, our politics overflows with partisan bile, and each of our major parties views the other as the country's biggest problem. Our problem is not that we aren't expressing our broadly shared aspirations through public policy, but that we aren't forming broadly shared aspirations. That's what we need help with from our system now. We need help in finding ways to act together when we don't think alike. And that suggests that we'll need to choose to prioritize cohesion, coalition building, and the forging of trust. And to do that, we should begin by recognizing that these are among the original aims of our Constitution, and that today's intense disunity has been driven in part by our broken constitutional practice, which has undermined the means by which these aims could be pursued in our system. To recover those means, to better pursue those aims, we'll need to recover the understanding of unity that undergirds the Constitution, to grasp its appeal and its truth, to think about reforms of our institutions in its light. Rather than rush to reshape our institutions in the mold of our worst contemporary civic vices, we should let the structure of our institutions teach us something about what we're doing wrong, and should then think about how we might reform those institutions to better achieve their own highest aims. That aspiration suggests not only an agenda for reform, but a particular spirit in which to approach that work. Citizens who want to see our society grow stronger should approach its institutions in a spirit of repair, informed by a sense of what is missing and has gone wrong, but inspired by a sense of what's good in what we have, what could serve us well. This moment tempts us to repudiate our inheritance, but it requires us to renew it. Americans are frequently angry at our Constitution now because we sense that it's broken down. But if we grasp that we have broken it, we could see that it needs us if it's going to serve us. By rising to repair it, we could enable it again to repair our society and bring us closer together as it was made to do. The work of healing our divisions would have to start with our Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you all. We're now going to have questions. Our practice, as you all know who've been here before, is to take questions first from students. At some point, you'll have the power, the executive power, to decide when we can move to others. I also want to issue an invitation to those members of the audience who are on Zoom. You can put your questions into the chat, and I will read them. We'll try to get to as many as we can over the course of the conversation. But with that, you're in the driver's seat.
All right. So, students, I did spend time with some of you, so maybe I've tired you out. Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us who you are when you start.
So thank you very much for coming today. I was wondering, my name is Murphy. Thank you. I was wondering, you put forth the preamble of the Constitution as a kind of normative guide. And so I have a two-part question. And the first is, how does that factor, does it supplant or supplement the Declaration of Independence, which is kind of the traditional normative guide? And then also, you mentioned the spirit of the laws in your book. And I was wondering if that is a substantial way to make the normative intent of the Constitution. What role do the courts play in determining that, if they should determine what the law is instead of what it should be?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. Well, first of all, the preamble certainly doesn't supplant the Declaration of Independence. I don't think anything supplants the Declaration of Independence. And I think the Constitution flows from the logic and the principles of the Declaration. And the preamble describes in broad terms the very ambitious aims of American government. It does something that the Declaration doesn't do, in the sense that it gets into the substance and purpose of public policy. The Declaration offers a very simple, or at least straightforward, idea of what governments are instituted for, right? To protect our rights, and that's certainly true. But governments are also instituted to advance certain national goals, to meet certain national needs. The reason we needed the Constitution is that the government we had before, under the Articles of Confederation, was not a very effective government. That certainly did mean that it didn't effectively protect the rights of some Americans, but it also meant that it just didn't allow the nation to achieve core political and policy objectives. The Constitution rises to achieve that. It also describes, and the system as a whole, describes a system that is fundamentally democratic in our terms now. That is, it's accountable to the public. The Declaration of Independence actually doesn't do that. It says government has to be established through the consent of the people, but it suggests that there are a lot of forms of government that would be legitimate if they're established that way. It doesn't suggest that monarchy is, say, an illegitimate form of government. The Constitution answers some questions that are left open on behalf of the American public. Now, that doesn't mean that ours is the only legitimate mode of government, but it does mean that it is our answer to what a legitimate and effective government would look like in American life, or at least what it did look like to the framers of the Constitution and in their time. I think the vision it offers is still very appealing and very effective. The preamble is not law, right? It's not, it generally, there is actually one kind of funny exception, but it generally has not been used by the courts to interpret the Constitution. And a lot of the Constitution, I think, once you see that fact, becomes clearer, because the Constitution, while it is law, is not only law. It's the supreme law of the land. It can be interpreted by judges and applied, and it creates the framework for legislative action, for lawmaking at the national level. But the Constitution is more than law. It's a legal framework. It's also, as I suggest in the book, an institutional framework, a policy-making framework. And it is, as you're pointing to, a political framework. It describes the way of life of the American people in a way that suggests something about the spirit of our politics. I think that's very important for how we as citizens, and also for how legislators, and in certain moments for how executives think about their roles, our roles, and the role of our government. But the courts apply the Constitution as law. That means that there's a limit to how far and how broad they can get in their interpretation of the meaning of the Constitution. The courts do decide the meaning of the law, but there are also ways in which the spirit of our Constitution can be violated by other constitutional actors that are not necessarily illegal. I think, for example, that when a president signs a statute and says, I actually think this is unconstitutional, but I'm going to leave that to the courts, that is a failure of presidential responsibility. The president that I worked for, George W. Bush, did that with the McCain-Feingold bill, which should have been vetoed because it was unconstitutional. And he said so and signed it. And the courts did not throw it out. It's in effect today. I think that when a president says, if Congress doesn't act, I will, that president is telling us that he will violate the Constitution, right? As President Obama did with regard to immigration, as President Biden has done with regard to student loans, President Trump did in directing money to the wall. If Congress doesn't act, I will, that's not a way to describe appropriate action in our system. Now, it's not necessarily illegal, right? And the courts are not necessarily in a position to strike it down. In some situations, maybe they are. In others, maybe they're not. But we as citizens should be able to see that that kind of action is counter-constitutional. It's a violation of the spirit of American political life. And so you can't leave constitutionalism to judges. The role of judges is limited. It has to be limited. Judges have an awful lot of power. If they could just act based on what they think the spirit of the laws should be, we would be in big trouble. They need to act based on what the text of the law says. But the rest of us, as citizens, as policymakers, need to act with a broader sense of what our constitutional obligations are. And being a citizen of a republic like this is demanding. It means that there are constraints and there are obligations, and we can't just do whatever we want and leave it to judges to clean it up.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sam. Within this role of the citizen that you're talking about, and also that often within these 5 constitutional frameworks that you've outlined, that we kind of lose track of some of them. What do you think the role is in kind of improving the constitutional literacy of the general American public and citizen, especially in our electorate, where a very not even close to 100% of us vote in elections who are eligible?
Yeah. I think it's a complicated question. I don't think it's absolutely necessary for the functioning of American politics that every American be able to recite the Constitution. That's a high bar. It's hard. I do think we want to have some general familiarity with the kind of system it creates and the kinds of demands it makes of us. And I think generally Americans actually do. You'll find constitutional premises, constitutional logic making their way into all kinds of areas of American life. A couple of years ago, a few friends of my son were arguing outside, and one of them said, I have a right to free speech. And he was like 9 years old. And I thought that's a start. Okay, there are other things, but we do have a sense. We do have a sense that we are rights bearing. We do have a sense that now that sense very often extends to what other people owe us. That's just natural. It would be better if we knew more about what we owe one another. I think that demand increases as our involvement in politics increases. It would be good, for example, if members of Congress were familiar with Article 1 of the Constitution, which it often seems they are not. At Mount Vernon, they have George Washington's copy of the Constitution, where he actually wrote the word president next to every line in the Constitution that created some obligation on him when he became president. There had never been a president before, and he just didn't know what to do. I think every one of our presidents should start out by doing that, by maybe just looking at his Constitution, because he got it right, but also by looking through the Constitution and thinking, what really is my job? Because a lot of what they do now isn't quite their job. And look, I think if I ask myself, how can I help constitutional literacy? That's one reason to write a book like this. That's one thing I can do. I think we can try to inform ourselves about it, to read about it, to be good students of it, to be thoughtful citizens, which doesn't just mean learning what we have, but also thinking about how things could be improved, what could be better in American life. How does this system let us achieve that? And in what ways are we going to have to make changes? So I'm a fan of active citizenship. I don't measure that by voter participation necessarily. When I was an AU student, the thought was, and Robert Putnam wrote an essay that we read a lot in those days. I graduated in 1999. The thought was, low voter participation is the first symptom of the collapse of our civic life. And if you look at Putnam's book that he wrote later, Bowling Alone, that's what he says. The first of his chapters is about voter participation. Well, since he wrote that book, we've had the 3 highest voter participation elections in American history. The highest was the last election, the 2020 election, which had the highest voter participation rates since before women could vote. I'm not sure that I would say that, therefore, I think we're in a healthier place than we were 20 years ago. Because there is a way in which intense engagement in politics can be a sign of trouble, too. And we have to look for more complex kinds of indicators of civic health than just that simple measure of whether people are voting. And I think by a lot of important measures, we are in some trouble. But yeah, some civic literacy is a place to start, certainly.
Hi, I'm George. Thanks for speaking tonight. So I have another question about the preamble, actually. So we've sort of seen some waves of populism in America, right and left recently. And I feel like even the phrase "we the people" or "who counts as the people" has become sort of hyper-partisan and it's been distorted. So you talked about coming to the Constitution with the spirit of repair. How do we repair such a fundamental distortion of a principle that underlies all of our laws and everything?
I'll tell you why I love this question. First of all, my original title for this book was "We." My publisher would have none of that, and she was surely right. But "we" is the first word of the Constitution. The document does begin with "we the people," and I thought of that as a title also because it speaks to something in my own story. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. My family came here when I was 8, and I became an American citizen when I was 19, while I was an AU student. I took the citizenship oath at the federal courthouse in Newark, which is not America's most beautiful city. And after the oath, the judge who gave it to us, this man in my mind is this grizzled old judge, but I was 19, so maybe he was like 40. He got up to give a speech, and I thought he was going to talk about Lincoln or the founders. And instead, he said something kind of strange to us. He said, "From now on, you have to think and talk about America in the first person plural." And here you have all these new Americans kind of looking at each other like, I don't think that was on the test. I will tell you that at 19, I was not sure what he meant. But he explained, he said, you have to talk about America using terms like "we" and "us." And in the experience of immigrants, there's often this big they, right? The locals, the natives, they're your reality. They're you have to deal with. And becoming a citizen means understanding yourself as part of the whole. saying we and meaning Americans. I was disappointed with that little speech, I have to admit, but I'm repeating it here so many years later because it was, I think, exactly what we needed to hear, and not just we immigrants, but what we Americans now need to hear. We have lost the knack for saying we and meaning the American people. When we say we now, we just mean the people on our team, the people in our party, and we all live with a big they who are ruining the country. And look, a lot of the time I do think they're ruining the country, but we nonetheless have to understand that our struggle with the big they is a struggle for our common life together, right? What we're arguing about is how are we going to live together as one nation? Not whether we will, but how. And that means that we ultimately have to think about all of us as constituting one people. That's part of why to think about our nation through the framework of a constitution is a helpful way to think about it. And I do think we have to find ways to rebuild that knack, to use the first person plural where we can, to engage in coalition building where we can. The only way to build up those virtues is to build them up as habits, to just do it. And not to stand around and wait for members of Congress to do it. They're not going to be the first, they're going to be the last. But to do it in your own life and to do it in your own community and to find ways where you are to get through a project together with people without taking offense at what they think about Donald Trump or what they think about you thinking about Donald Trump or whatever. It's hard to do now, right? But it is very important that we build up that habit, that we build up that knack, because ultimately the kind of renewal that we're talking about has to start from the bottom up. It has to start with people who understand the challenges of citizenship as fundamentally a challenge common to all of us. I think that also is connected with civic education. It's connected with a certain kind of constitutional literacy, but it's also just a matter of habits. Just being able to see your neighbors as human beings. And yeah, they have political views, but there's other things about them. And they, you have some concerns in common, some interests in common. Find ways to let those define what you do together. And understand that you can act together, even if you don't agree about everything. We've lost the knack for doing that for a lot of reasons now. Civic and technological and cultural and political. We're just in the habit of talking only to people we agree with about people we disagree with. And that's not going to work.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. You mentioned in your book that you think that there are rare occasions where the Declaration of Independence can be used as an interpretive instrument by judges seeking to apply the Constitution. So I was just wondering, what are these rare instances and how would they work?
Yeah, I was persuaded of this by reading Clarence Thomas. I think that I would have said otherwise before I encountered this really incredible essay that he wrote before he was a judge. And where he takes up this question basically of whether it is the Declaration law. He acknowledges that it's a complicated question and that in general it is not law, but he begins from this peculiar fact that the Declaration of Independence is the first item in the US Code. It was adopted by the first Congress after the ratification of the Constitution into our statute books. It's written there. Now, it's not clear what that's supposed to mean. What are you supposed to do with that, right? But he suggests that there can be situations, and he talked in particular about the Congress that created the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, where to take our bearings constitutionally requires us to reach further into the American soul and to correct some failings of the Constitution. We have to understand ourselves as defined most fundamentally by the Declaration of Independence. Now, what that Congress did was amend the Constitution, right? So that's not a case where a judge would say the Declaration is law and therefore overrides that it's somehow constitutional and overrides an act of Congress. But I do think that it matters that the Declaration is in the U.S. Code. I think it matters that we've taken the action as a people of treating it as a kind of law. And, the Declaration really is the animating spirit of American life. It's an extraordinary thing, and we should not take it for granted. It sets us apart in a way that we should be proud of and that we should take seriously, which we obviously haven't always done in America.
Um, my name is Tyler. I'm curious about your idea of American federalism as two parallel governments and not overlapping governments. And kind of going back to the earlier question, how does that work with this construction of a we?
Yeah.
Where there's two, in some ways, there's two political communities in the sense that you're a part of, if you take political community to be the people under a set of, in an institution, under an institution, or under a set of laws. In American federalism, that means there would in some ways be two political communities, the national political community, but also the state political community.
Mhm.
I'm skeptical whether you can really be a part of these two without giving supremacy to one over the other. I don't know that you can really
Yeah.
have co-equal political communities. And so how would you reconcile that? Would you say that the state political community would reign supreme, or would it be the other way around?
I think supremacy is an important word in that question. The Constitution does give supremacy to the federal government in cases where there is a direct conflict. And the supremacy clause means to say what it says. But the Constitution also tries to minimize occasions when there could be such conflict, so that most of the time we don't have to ask, which do we choose? And it is possible to let different communities make different decisions, answer the same question in different ways at the same time, and still be one nation. Now, I think that's a fact about diversity. Diversity is the basic reality of modern life. What separates classical politics from modern politics, I would argue, is the fact of moral diversity. Now, there was some in the classical world, obviously, too. But the extent of it in our modern experience is what is extraordinary about our modern experience. And a lot of our political thought has been a struggle about how to live with that and not be at war all the time. Because there are a lot of instances where that has fallen apart, and we have been at war over questions that from a distance seem really small. I'm Jewish, and I just can't tell the different Protestants apart, and they fought a 100-year war. It wasn't even Catholics and Protestants. So those reasons were serious reasons, and you could see why, if the question has to be resolved for the nation, you can arrive at a place where there is no other way to resolve it than to fight. And of course, we've had such a question in American life too. I think it is a question that is rooted in the Declaration of Independence. It is ultimately about whether we are all equal, and we did have to fight a war with one another about how to resolve that question. But not every question needs to work that way. And part of the secret to living amid diversity is finding ways to let people live in different ways at the same time, even though it is your view that they're doing it wrong. I think that that's part of what has always been hard for some Americans about our system. I guess I find it a little easier being from a 2% minority in our society. I think if we just empower a Caesar, he's just not likely to be all that great for me. But I don't think he would be all that great for anybody. And ultimately, to see that it is in allowing people a very great degree of freedom in making the most fundamental kinds of choices that we can actually pay greatest respect to the underlying fact we do agree about, which is that we are all equal in basic human dignity. It is because we are equal that I don't think I can force somebody to practice my religion if they don't believe it's true, right? And so ultimately that underlying commitment, which we do share and do not compromise, is why we're able to compromise elsewhere. It's hard to do. It's hard in every generation in different ways. But I do think that it's necessary if we're going to be able to sustain any kind of free society in modern circumstances. And we're not the only society that does it. I mean, there are massively diverse societies in different parts of the world, not everywhere. The societies that are most satisfied with themselves tend to actually be not very diverse, and they'll tell us how little public violence they have. And I was going, oh, if we just had Swedes here, we probably wouldn't have that much violence either. And the Swedes have learned that lesson, God knows, in the last 30 years. It's hard. This is very hard to do, but we have been doing it for some time, and others have too. And so I don't think liberalism is impossible. Look around.
If I could just ask a follow-up question on that. So it sounds like what you're saying is that the Constitution puts forth a national political community that allows for diversity within it and not a confederation of smaller political communities living together.
That's right. There is such a thing as an American.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's hard to deny in the world. There is such a thing as an American. No one other than Americans would deny that. We sometimes do deny it, but we're just wrong. And so, yes, there is a national identity. There is a kind of, I don't love the term national community. This is a very big society, and community has really a particular meaning. But in the way that you're describing it, I do agree with you.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you move from philosophical to the practical, and you think about what unites us as Americans, and you talk about the Constitution. Are there practical things that you see out there that give you optimism about us learning how to bridge those differences that we seem to be so confronted with in the current day?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, and we just talked about this with the students too. I wouldn't say optimism. I'm a conservative and I'm not an optimist. I don't think that if we just sit back, everything's going to be great. But I'm not a pessimist either. And I think that ultimately, between optimism and pessimism, which are both dangerous vices, because they both invite us to be passive, there is a virtue. It's called hope. And I am very hopeful. I am very hopeful about America. I think that you can't help but be hopeful in looking at the history of our country and what kinds of challenges it has been able to rise from and renew itself. And in looking at the life of this country. I mean, look, underlying all of my work is just the simple premise that America is just awesome. It is incredible. It has a lot of problems. Those problems are my daily work. That is what I work on. But the fact that this country is here to let us live the kinds of lives we get to live, to let us have the kinds of arguments we have about how those lives should be lived, is an incredible achievement. And we should be grateful for it and not underestimate the capacity that it provides us for renewal and for solving our problems. I also, in the book, there are practical ideas for policy change. I tend to think about the kind of culture change we're talking about here in institutional terms. I think institutional change is how culture change actually happens as a practical matter. And so I talk about incentives and how to change the ways in which both citizens and public officials make decisions about politics. I think, for example, that our primary system is not a good fit for contemporary political culture. Maybe it wasn't always terrible, but it is terrible now. And we have to think our way out of this system so that we're not stuck with a politics populated by people who no one wants to vote for. I think that there are ways to help the Congress function better by incentivizing legislative work rather than incentivizing performative theatrics, which we do now. Those would be fairly mundane kinds of reforms. And I think ultimately, those are how big changes get started.
So you talked about negotiation in the Congress and, presumably negotiation in the Congress in an ideal form has members of Congress representing their constituencies equally. But a big problem we have, at least according to current Supreme Court interpretation of campaign finance law, is that we've basically taken away all restraints on campaign finance. And so we have millionaires and billionaires who can pour money into elections. I mean, they have to do it indirectly through super PACs and stuff. But we know that this has an enormous influence on the decisions. I mean, I've literally heard from staffers, who will admit this to me, that I take my donors' points of view more seriously than others. And so given that constitutional interpretation and given the ideal of a negotiation treating all citizens equally, I mean, it just seems like these two things don't go together. Can we work around the interpretation? How do we?
Yeah, I think,
ideal?
well, first of all, I think the court is right about the Constitution, but I think the situation that it has created is a function of the ways we've attempted to reform the campaign finance system. So those reforms begin from the premise that the parties are the bad guys. They have to be disempowered and their capacity to serve as the fundamental venues for campaign financing has to be stripped of them, which was done over a long period of time, starting in the 1970s. And then all kinds of constraints have to be put on the ways in which individuals can contribute. Now, the court said those constraints have to go. The constraints on parties don't have to go, but they should go, especially if the others do. We've been left in a place where the only way to raise money is secretly, and that is nuts. That's not a good way for our system to operate. And so I think the way forward is to undo the campaign finance reforms of the 1970s and allow the parties again to function as the distributors of campaign finance of first resort. The parties have been weakened in a number of ways that have harmed our politics. The irony is that the parties as institutions are actually moderating influences on partisanship, right? The parties as institutions need to win elections all over the country. If you need to win elections in Mississippi and in Oregon, then you want to build a broad coalition. You want to avoid very off-putting crazy people. But if you're not able to work that way, and instead you have to make your appeal to intensely devoted political activists and donors, then the party's not able to play that role, and individual politicians have incentives to push in the other direction. I think that's had a lot to do with undermining the capacity of our politics to build coalitions. We've undermined the parties through the primary system in a similar direction, right? The parties don't really choose candidates now. Candidates are chosen by an almost random electorate. 8% of the American population turns out to vote on primary election day. And they're the craziest people in America, right? Because they love politics. Well, I love politics. I vote in primaries, but my priorities are not going to be everybody's. And the result of asking 8% of the public who is most intensely devoted to partisan politics who they think should be in the system is what we have. We have a system that has been populated by crazy people. And the primaries now need to be rethought. Now, I don't think we can go back to a pre-primary system of just kind of backroom selection of candidates, but I think there are ways that we can experiment with different modes of candidate selection. I talk in the book about ranked choice and a few other things in the primaries that I think could strengthen the parties and could allow them to do their core work, which is ultimately to enable coalition building in our system. The parties now can't do that work. I think campaign finance reforms are part of the reason. Primaries are another, and those are both places. And look, these changes would be very hard to do, right? Because you'd have to get the people who get elected in the current system to agree to change that system. I do not pretend to know how to make that case to them persuasively, but I think that case at least has to be made to everybody else.
So I work in, my name's Ivory, but I work in Congress, and I was wondering how, and I've kind of seen firsthand how politicians and congressmen sort of use constitutional interpretation to advance their own political agenda.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how likely is it, or maybe how hopeful are you that politicians and those in power are able to switch how they view the Constitution from using it as, a means for their political agenda to viewing it in this sort of union mindset that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the appeal of a more unifying politics is that it would allow them to advance their political agenda. This kind of coalition building politics is not an alternative to pursuing your agenda. It's the only way to do it, right? Tell me what you care about. You care about the federal budget, you care about climate. You can't do anything about it until Congress works better. And so the argument for Congress working better is not that you should give up your priorities. It's that this is the only way to achieve anything. Now, it does mean you can't achieve everything. And it does mean that you have to make some concessions to decide what you prioritize more and reach some agreement about what you can live with that the other side prioritizes more. That can work. I mean, look, it happens now and then. And I got to be a witness while I was an AU student to the 1997 budget deal. I was a House Budget Committee staffer. That deal was made by people who did not like each other, to put it mildly. It was made by House Republicans and Bill Clinton. And my boss, John Kasich, who was the chairman of the budget committee, had a very, very low opinion of Bill Clinton. But there were things he wanted to do. And by the way, I assume Clinton did of him. I don't know, but you'd have to assume that. There were things he wanted to do. There were things Clinton wanted to do. They understood that each of them had some priorities here in this process, and they talked to each other. Neither of them was super happy with the outcome, but each of them was somewhat happy with the outcome. And that's what success looks like. I think we've gotten to a place now where the key priority of each party is not to give an inch to the other party, right? That's actually what you're trying to achieve. And so the only way to achieve that is to achieve nothing else. And there are too many people in our politics, including members of Congress, who run saying, I will never give an inch. That is running saying, I will never do my job, right? There are all kinds of jobs you could have if you're just not the kind of person who likes to negotiate with people you don't like. Member of Congress is not one of those jobs, right? It's not, I mean, the core description is to do just that. So that's why I suggest that how we populate this system it needs to be thought through a little better. And that's not in the Constitution. In many states, it's not even in the law. It has to be done through decisions by the parties and in some places at the state law level. But we have to see the way in which this isn't working, which I think really does become very powerfully evident when you spend a lot of time with members and staff.
Can I get a Zoom question?
Sure.
So my role here is to be prophet of Zoom. Mouthpiece of Zoom. This is a question from Kyle Svensson, who, if I'm not mistaken, is an AU alum. If pluralism, as in the US Constitution, owes its tolerance to its Christian tradition, does it work when religions without the tolerance of Christianity are part of our pluralism, assuming there are some? If it doesn't work, how do we fix it?
Well, I think it can. That's a question, right? It's a real question. And can this work has always been a real question about American political life, and I think really about the politics of any society. We can't just assume that the preconditions are there for all of this to work. We have to work to sustain them. We have to work to help people see why they matter. I think the United States has been reasonably successful at the kind of assimilation of religious minorities that is required for our society to persist. That happened with Catholics in the 19th century when people thought it was impossible. And in some ways, in theory, maybe it was impossible, but we did in practice. So maybe we need a new theory. I think that it has happened with other religious minorities in our own time, smaller ones. And so to me, that suggests that it is possible. It does not prove that it will work. But I think, again, anytime you think about political change, political reform, you have to ask yourself, compared to what? And what really is the alternative to trying to make this work? I think the arguments that liberalism is untenable have to be confronted with that question. What then do you propose? And I don't think they have a good answer, a persuasive answer to that question that would speak to the American people.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm wondering what you think about the future of constitutional amendments. So you mentioned at the outset that you don't believe that the Constitution is something that is outdated, that can't keep up with the times. But have we reached a point where we're beyond constitutional amendments? It's been a while since we've been through that process. Are we oversaturated with it? What's your take on that process?
Good question. I in some sense, I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm the kind of conservative who doesn't really think that we have a problem to which a constitutional amendment is the answer at this moment. I don't know what would be worth the expending of political capital involved in advancing a constitutional amendment right now. There are other things that we can expand that kind of capital for. And I guess I just haven't been persuaded that any of the existing amendment ideas are worth it or are achievable or would be an improvement. But that's not to say that the Constitution is perfect. I think many of the amendments we have were improvements. I think some of them were not. But it's worth seeing when you look at American history that constitutional amendments come in bunches. There's often been a long period between groups of amendments. And there was the Bill of Rights, which was 10 at one time, a couple of others after that when the Electoral college turned out to create crazy situations that had to be fixed immediately. And then we went quite a while. There were the post-Civil War amendments, and we went quite a while. And then there were the progressive era amendments, and we went quite a while. There were several amendments then in the Vietnam era. And we haven't really had a serious constitutional amendment since. The 27th Amendment, not to say it's unserious, but it was symbolic. The 27th Amendment just says that Congress can't raise its pay until the next session of Congress.
Right.
It was in the original Bill of Rights. Madison loved it. Congress didn't pass it. Imagine why. And around the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, a college student in California wrote a paper saying, well, we should pass this now in honor of James Madison. And his teacher said, that's not a bad idea. And then his senator, Barbara Boxer, said, that's not a bad idea. And it went all the way and became a constitutional amendment enacted in the early 1990s.
Hope he got an A.
Yeah, really. It's in the Constitution. But I don't think of that as breaking the pattern. I think it's been a very long time since we've had a real constitutional amendment that begins with public dissatisfaction, the state legislatures move, Congress moves. That's not to say it's unimaginable, but you know, we live in a 50-50 period here in American politics, a long one, a very unusually long one, where we haven't really had a majority party for more than a generation now. And it's hard to see how you get the kinds of supermajorities for an amendment. And I don't know that, again, that I've seen the argument for a particular amendment that could overcome that for now.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. My name is Sebastian. During your presentation, you spoke briefly about the disagreement that you want, that you think the Constitution can enable, that is more constructive than the disagreement that currently have in modern politics. I'm wondering to an audience of students and otherwise people in academia, how you might give us advice as to manifest that on our college campus or in the wider community. And as you say, that culture change comes from institutional change. Is there advice you might give me to relay back to professors, admin, something like that?
Is there ever? Well, let me start with this. I think that the lost knack, the lost habit is something like coalition building, which doesn't really come naturally to us now. I think part of the reason that's happened for all of us, maybe particularly for younger Americans, has to do with a kind of confusion of expression for action in contemporary American culture, where we think that when we've said something, we've done something. And the fact is, to say something is to do almost nothing about that thing, right? To give a thumbs up on social media, you haven't done a damn thing. Nothing's changed. When we think about movements for political change in American history, we now emphasize the ways in which they were expressive, right? So the civil rights movement had a lot of protests. Well, the civil rights movement had a lot more than protests. It was a highly organized political movement, deeply aware of the importance and power of coalition building, and understood that its purpose was to appeal to people who did not start out agreeing with its aims. That's hard to do. It takes time. It takes a certain kind of disposition. It's very, very draining and tough. And the civil rights movement succeeded because it was willing and able to pull that off. I don't think that there are a lot of political activists in America now on any side of any issue who know how to do that very well. And to begin from the simple premise, my goal is to persuade people who don't agree. If you listen to a lot of our politics now, people's goal is to activate people who do agree. That's a different goal. Now, it's not crazy. You need to get your voters out, but it's not enough, especially when you're evidently not in the majority, right? And what it does is exacerbate frustration rather than alleviate it. It doesn't give you a way out of the kind of stuck feeling that American politics is in. And I think a lot of what would be required would be a sense that the way out is by building coalitions, is by saying, this is what I need, what do you need? To people who are not all the way on the other side of the issue from you, but who could go either way, who could be on either team. I think that's something we can practice in the institutions that we're part of. There's certainly ways that universities could do that better. I think it's something that we could practice as citizens. It's certainly something that we should expect and demand of politicians. Specifically, what you should demand that your professor do, maybe we'll talk about later.
Wait, I thought you were going to tell us.
No. No, look, I do think that there's an important, and this has been a critical issue in the university debates. Universities are one of those places where it's possible to encounter voices that are not yours and views that are not yours. And to the extent that universities come to believe that their purpose is to shut down those voices, to narrow the range of debate in American life, which too many universities seem to believe is their role, then they're undermining American civic life. And I do think on that front, when it comes to facilitating a broader range of views so that students can be better educated, better informed, better able to participate, is essential in the contemporary academy. That is certainly a way that American universities have failed dramatically in the 21st century. And it's a failure they need to recognize. I think that's been happening increasingly, but obviously there's a lot more work to do. And it's not easy work, and it's not safe work. And it's easy for me to talk about it, not being a professor. It's hard to do when your livelihood is at stake and when the place where you live becomes a hostile place to be.
I have more Zoom questions. So Jeremy Dano, my colleague here in the Department of Government, asked, when did the Constitution work best to help us act together even when we disagree? When did it do second best? Why did it work better then?
Yeah, it's a fine question. There are a couple of ways that you could think about that question. I think that the Constitution has tended to work best for us when there has been, for an extended duration, a clear majority coalition in the American two-party system. Our system is strange. It is generally just a two-party system for reasons that run very deep to the structure of it. And broadly speaking, when in that kind of system you have a broad, durable majority, that majority is engaged in sustaining a very complicated coalition. When you're the minority for a long time, all you can think about is how to broaden your coalition. And both those parties are engaged in coalition building. And after a time, at least so far in our history, there's been a kind of change election, realigning election that has allowed the minority party to achieve majority status for a time. Generally speaking, majority coalitions have lasted, not forever, not for generations, but for decades. We have now lived in the longest stretch of 50-50 politics in American history. And the next longest was much shorter. It was about 18 years at the end of the 19th century. It was actually similar to this one. We had a lot of contested elections, a lot of legitimacy crises, 2 elections where the popular vote and the electoral vote were different. And so I think one way to answer that question is that there's a kind of underlying structural challenge here, which is related to the constitutional problem. The parties today are not doing a good enough job of broadening their coalitions. They're not thinking about how to do it. And I think they could. There's an implicit assumption that you can't get more than 50% plus one voter in America now, and that's just not true. You can see that in some states where by running a good candidate, you can have a Republican governor in Maryland for 8 years. It's possible. And that's a peculiar kind of coalition building exercise. Something like it could happen at the national level if we thought differently about what the purposes of the parties were. Our parties are both stuck in a kind of post-Cold War moment where they're having a lot of trouble thinking about basic issues that are now most important to the American people. Neither of them has any idea what America's role in the world should be. Neither of them has anything approaching an economic policy. They're not going to win that way. They have to think about what to offer the public. So I think in moments like that, we've tended to see the possibility of reaching across and building complicated coalitions between a durable majority and a durable minority. The civil rights era is like this. We think of the civil rights era as having been achieved by the presidents and the courts of those years. But the achievements of that period were legislative. The important enduring things were the Civil Rights Act of the mid-50s and of the mid-60s. And those were achieved by long, arduous bargaining processes. They were very, very hard negotiating processes at a time when there was a majority party in Congress, but it was complicated. It was internally divided, as big majorities are. So I think these problems of the breakdown of the party system and the incapacity of our coalition building are related, and that in looking for better times, it makes sense to look for a situation where both are working a little better than they are now. Things do get done. We shouldn't say that nothing passes Congress now. That's not true. But there are large issues that have been left on the table because our 50-50 moment is not able to deal with them. And everybody knows they're just sitting there and nobody can do anything about it.
Well, it is
Thank you.
7 o'clock, so I think we'll. Most importantly, we're proud of who you are and what you do. And we just really want to say thanks for coming here and spending time with us to talk about this. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at the next PTI event. Please come back. Good night.